Welcome to the Judgment Call podcast, a podcast where I bring together some of the most curious minds on the planet. Risk takers, adventurers, travelers, investors, entrepreneurs, and simply mind-bogglers. To find all episodes of this show, simply go to Spotify, iTunes, or YouTube, or go to our website, judgmentcallpodcast.com. If you like this show, please consider leaving a review on iTunes or subscribe to us on YouTube. This episode of the Judgment Call podcast is sponsored by Mighty Travels Premium. Full disclosure, this is my business. What we do at Mighty Travels Premium is to find the airfare deals that you really want. Thousands of subscribers have saved up to 95% in their airfare. Those include $150 round-trip tickets to Hawaii from many cities in the US, or $600 lie-flat tickets in business class from the US to Asia, or $100 business class lie-flat tickets from Africa round-trip all the way to Asia. In case you didn't know, about half the world is open for business again and accepts travelers. Most of those countries are in South America, Africa, and Eastern Europe. To try out Mighty Travels Premium, go to mightytravels.com/MTP, or if that's too many letters for you, simply go to MTP, the number 4, and the letter U.com to sign up for your 30-day free trial. And we know you as a historian of science and technology, which is a very particular, very interesting field. How did you decide this is for you? How did you make this your own?
It really, like everything in my life, just sort of happened by accident. I never had any plan. I just sort of followed the path of least resistance, and things happened to me. But in some ways, becoming a historian of science was intentional. In that, early in my life, somebody wrote a book about me when I was in my 20s. So when I was 25, effectively my biography came out, which is way too young, and that's extremely dangerous. So it's like rock music or something. You become incredibly well known at the age of 21. What do you do? And so at 25, I became widely known as this guy who lived in a tree house and built kayaks, and I kind of knew that I would be that guy for the rest of my life if I didn't push something else. So that's sort of what pushed me into but the actual becoming a historian, you become a historian, or I had no credentials. I dropped out of high school, so all that happened by accident. I mean, the only way I became reputable was I wrote a book, and that book was called Darwin Among the Machines. It was actually written in this. I'm in what used to be the walk-in cooler I'm in an old tavern on the waterfront, and this is where they used to keep the kegs of beer. So I wrote this insanely sort of strange book, Darwin Among the Machines, in this beer cooler before there was internet. So if I wanted to use the internet, I had to go up to the university and log in. But I wrote this book about the internet in this sort of dark, quiet beer cooler. And it somehow was the right book at the right time. And so it sort of instantly I changed from, being that guy who lived in the treehouse to being that guy who wrote Darwin Among the Machines, and just sort of changed overnight.
What inspired you to write that book, from what I understand? It details the history of technology, but it also makes predictions, right? It kind of extends certain arcs into the future.
Yes, at that time, of course, I was still very naive and innocent, and thought I had all the ideas and the answers, and had been, up till then, just a kayak builder. So the way this happened was a very fancy culture magazine in Japan commissioned me to write an article about nature and technology. And the assumption was I would write about kayaks. That's all I was supposed to know. And for some reason, out of that frustration of, God, why do they always just want to know about my kayaks or my treehouse, I wrote an essay about computers taking over the world. How when I had been a child, growing up in Princeton, there was one computer, and anybody in the world who had a problem that could run on a coded von Neumann machine, they came there to use that one machine. And now this was the 1980s, late 80s. We're living in a world where computers starting to swap floppy disks and connect on networks and stuff. So I sort of saw that coming and wrote this essay, and then a literary agent read the essay and he called me up. I was actually in Alaska when he at that time, because he didn't have cell phones, but I checked my messages, and there was a message from this book agent in New York, and there was no deep book about sort of the history of computer networks in a sort of literary sense. At that time, mainstream publishers weren't publishing books about computers. It was really one publisher, Addison Wesley, and they bought that book, which was just a complete risk on their part. Buy a technical book on history of computing from some kid who was living in a tavern building kayaks.
But I think we need to disclose that you had amazing access to the future of technology through your dad, right? Through Freeman Dyson, who's very famous for the Dyson sphere that everyone in science fiction knows, how to harvest power from a star, and that's still one of these big strokes of genius and knowledge from our perspective as readers and followers of physics and what's going on in technology. When you said earlier, people wrote a biography about you, that was because you were that kid, you were the son of your father. Why were people interested in your biography and in your personal life in the first place?
Yes, and my life was sort of set up. I mean, it was sort of low-hanging fruit for a biography, because my father, who was a theoretical mathematician most of his life, he had one really great adventure in his life. I mean, it was the adventure of World War II, where he was kept on the ground doing what we now call operations research for the Royal Air Force Bomber Command, but he didn't get to fly. And then later, after he came to America, he got deeply involved in a project called Project Orion. And this was started before NASA existed, sort of an answer to the Russian Sputnik. And the plan was to build a really large spaceship, a spaceship the size of an ocean liner. Takeoff weight from the Nevada desert would have been 4,000 tons. And this was a serious project. It was funded. It was actually the first project that ARPA funded, who later became known for creating the internet. And that was the great adventure of my father's life. And unfortunately, it didn't happen. But I grew up, of course, it started when I was 5 years old. It was this fantastic dream. And then in my own life, I, in a way, repeated the same thing. I mean, I built this crazy, enormous 48-foot kayak. It was sort of the Project Orion of kayaks. And a writer, Kenneth Brower, who actually was the older brother of my childhood friend, he just saw that, and so that's a story. Sort of the sort of mirroring of the big kayak in the oceans of Earth and the giant spaceship in the oceans of space. It just he wrote a beautiful book about it. The book was very successful for kind of a good reason. It was this father-son story that captured everybody's. It's still in print. It's back in print now with a foreword by Neil Stephenson, the science fiction writer who knew both of us and wrote a very beautiful foreword to the sort of 25-year reprinting of this book.
Yeah, I saw that Neil Stephenson is a big fan of yours and your dad's.
He built one of my kayaks. He not only built one of my kayaks, he also with Jeff Bezos created a company that builds rockets. So Neil is sort of hands-on. He doesn't just write about things. He goes out and does them.
Yeah. Well, at first, and maybe he probably definitely not the first one who probably rediscovered that. But I read this book by Robert Zubrin about the need for space at the space age, and he goes through a couple of different technologies. just to see how we can get to the outer limits of the solar system and maybe beyond. And the Orion came up, and I was like, "Whoa, this is a good idea. Why didn't we try that? Why didn't we put this into operation at some point?" And it seemed to be based on a relatively simple technology, so to speak, so nuclear explosions that would power this spacecraft. Why was it never? And I think it was planned for quite some time. Why was it never built? Why was it never tested in the end?
That's a complex story. The simple answer that the myth that people believe was that it ended because of the nuclear test ban treaty, and that's really not true. The test ban treaty concerns testing weapons. Even after the test ban treaty, Ted Taylor, who really ran the project, he was pushing for still doing Orion as a joint venture with the Soviet Union, and that would be completely allowable. So the more important reason is sort of American politics, that it was not a NASA project, and NASA didn't invent it, NASA didn't own it, and effectively NASA would not support it. In order for it to politically move forward, it had to NASA had to support the mission, and because it used weapons for propulsion, the Air Force had to handle the propulsion. So the model that works is like science in Antarctica, where the Navy supplies the ships that take the scientists to Antarctica, but the National Science Foundation supplies the scientists and does the science. And that model could have worked for Orion, but NASA really didn't want to support a project that would have to use Air Force spaceships. So the Air Force sort of kept it on life support for a number of years, and still maintain they still have the files, technical files on it, and it was practically quite realistic, because we know how to make nuclear explosions. We're very good at it. It's the only way we really know how to harness nuclear energy in a very effective way. The problem is we sort of haven't grown up as a species yet, where we can, where we want to have a lot of very small nuclear weapons to not run the risk of them being used as weapons.
Is that a project that was very well known to the American or global public at the time, or was it kind of quite hidden? And because I only heard about it like 5 years ago. That's the first time I ever heard about it.
That's really the reason it couldn't succeed, because it was kept secret because of the bombs. It had to be kept secret. I mean, of course, when I wrote a book about it, I worked very hard to get as much declassified. So fantastic papers like my father's trips to satellites of the outer planets were classified all these years could finally be declassified. There really was nothing threatening in those papers, other than that you could sort of reverse engineer from reading these papers how small they were able to make these bombs, which is still a classified fact. But politically, because it was secret, you could never go to the public for support. One time, Ted Taylor was on a flight back from Washington, D.C. to California, and he must have had a couple martinis or something, but he got up and addressed everybody in the airplane and explained the project and said, would you give $1 a year to support this? Of course, everybody clapped and said yes, but they never had that chance.
Yeah, that's quite amazing that we were so close to, at least a theoretical model, to go to the outer parts of the solar system. Maybe there's something else. I don't know how this happened, and I've been talking about the Big Stagnation, Peter Thiel's team, quite a bit, that we have this low productivity growth since the 70s, lower than what we thought it would be, let's put it this way, and a lot of things that we thought would easily be available in 2020 are just not, like the flying cars, right? Or like vehicles we can cheaply go to Mars or to outer space. Do you have a theory, and you've done so much research about history, why we kind of see this breakdown of productivity growth? Is it that we lowered expectations? Is it us humans? Is it maybe an anthropology? Is it that we reached the limit of growth? A lot of people say there were technologies and they just came to an end of their life cycle and we haven't replaced them yet. But there seems to be, nobody has a really good handle on why we have this A, lower productivity growth, and B, it seems like the
the things, the imaginations of us humans, especially for me being a science fiction fan all over my life, it seems like we've really driven this back and said, the internet and a couple of Facebook posts, that's enough what we aspire to. Why did that happen since the 70s?
Yes, I can sort of give you two very different approaches to answering that. One is the sort of cynical answer that, well, we're not being productive because the great minds of our generations are wasting their time on their iPhones and playing video games, but that's not really true. I think the more technical answer is a metric. It's a measurement problem that we just, in terms of economics, we measure productivity in dollars, right? And that's just the way it's always been. The gross national product is the product of the country in dollars. If you measure productivity, if you choose a different metric, say what if you choose a metric that's transistors, not dollars? Then of course we've been insanely productive in producing transistors. They're just getting so cheap. So so when I was a child, it was a major investment for a family to have one color television. Color television was a center of the home. It was a big thing. Whereas now, of course, every kid has several color televisions. They haven't got one in their pocket. Yeah. So it's a problem that I think it's actually something we need to fix as a global economy. It's sort of this metric problem that we only measure productivity in dollars. But in the creativity sense, the sort of third answer is yes. We're not developing really new energy sources and things like that drove the leaps in productivity into the industrial revolution the first time, or the nuclear age or something. But maybe we don't need to. But and then the fourth problem is that we believe there's too much propaganda, and we believe it. I mean, we're really being fed a lot of PR about going to Mars and things like that just technically are very, very, very hard to do with chemical energy.
Yeah, it seems like when we look at things that are important to spacefaring, like the cost of energy per kilowatt hour, right, or the basically the launch cost. We want to get 1 ton somewhere near in some orbit. They haven't really moved much since the 50s, 40s. Maybe there's still like Nazi technology. You could say.
You can.
But the paradigm hasn't changed, and that seems to be something we as a species don't really want anymore. Like we feel like this is interesting. We read about it in science fiction, but we are not really going towards that goal. Do you feel that's natural? We just, as a humanity, we have decided it's not as important, or is it something where we run against the wall?
Yeah, we're not being realistic about. You can only do so much with hydrogen and oxygen, which are our two best chemical rocket fuels, and we got to that limit 50 years ago when we went to the moon, and all we can do is sort of repeat that unless we do something different. My father, Freeman, before he died, he wrote a foreword to it. It was going to be a new edition of the book about Project Orion. And in that, he very directly addresses the question of, is this something we should do now, or should we do it again? And he says clearly, no, there's better ways to do space travel than exploding nuclear bombs. But that doesn't mean the only way to do it is chemical rockets.
Yeah. When you look back into all that research that you did about the history of technology and specific technologies, what kind of surprised you the most when you started out in your 20s and started doing that research and started learning more about it? What was the fact that you felt like, whoa, I never really expected that, but either as a prediction or as a paradigm or as an axiom that you didn't expect?
I just was always surprised by the individual stories, which is what I do. I mean, I find individual people and talk to them, or read. If they're alive, I talk to them. If they're dead, I read their papers. And people were so creative, and of course, facing such obstacles in the sense of having ideas that were not taken seriously or something. It just kept person, and finally somebody has the idea, and it moves forward. But technology is very much driven by individuals. Now there's a argument. This is always a debate in sort of the field of history. Is it driven by the generals, or is it driven by by the armies, by the soldiers? And it's a mix of both. But for me, the interesting thing was finding the stories of how things actually happened, and how improvised so much. I mean, particularly the development of this first computer of von Neumann's that's now been the archetype for everything that followed. I mean, the guys who actually built it, and women, they had to build their own workbenches, and wire their own electrical outlets, and just start from zero. And the same
I
with
think
Earl.
one of your books really goes into specifics, but the first computer, right, about Turing and von Neumann. How much did these guys know what they were up to? How much did they know that they are creating intelligent machines at some point, if this continues on a certain trajectory?
They had a very clear idea of that. I mean, they knew exactly what they were doing and why they were doing it. They fully knew the world would never be the same. Now, they could not foresee that these things they built would become so cheap. I mean, that's what they failed to see, that you would have, the entire computing power of Los Alamos would now cost half a cent or something. That was just unfathomable at the time. But they clearly knew that these digital codes were going to change everything.
I'm always curious. We now have we extrapolate what comes out of Moore's law, and we talk about Ray Kurzweil a lot in this podcast, who has made this really famous, the age of the intelligent machines, and his predictions of what happens when we keep doubling. Is there someone who, and I think it's an observation, right? Moore's law. Is there someone who predicted it way before it started? Is there, or was it fully transparent in the early days of building semiconductors and transistors?
Well, Moore's law started once you had integrated circuits. So before, and Moore was very quick to see that, but not in advance. Sort of he kind of explained Moore's law to the world in the early 1960s. It had kind of started earlier, but I mean, the person who did sort of see it, and of course, many people probably saw it but didn't say anything about it. But the person who lectured about it was Richard Feynman. Gave a very clear, beautiful lecture in the late 1950s about how once you have machines that can build smaller machines, it's sort of going to be game over, because smaller machines will build smaller machines that will build smaller machines. And if they're smaller, what he knew as a physicist was if they're smaller, they're going to be cheaper and they're going to be faster. That's the key thing. Smaller computers are faster. So he saw that would definitely.
Do you think, if we are still on this trajectory, and you say Richard Feynman knew what he was talking about at that early stage, do you think we will just keep going and the intelligent machines will really have not a lot of use for humanity, so to speak, and that we are in that, there's a lot of fear there that we reach this with AI, or we reach it with the next generation of technology, whatever we want to call it. But there's a moment with our thinking power doesn't really make a dent anymore because it's so tiny compared to what machines are able to.
Yes, that's a big subject. I mean, that's what this latest story I wrote, Analogia, is kind of about that question of what's the difference between human minds and computers, and where are we seeing that wrong? I mean, it's so yes, I sort of answered like we said earlier, and we were talking about what we would talk about, that you can see that either way. You can say, oh, it's sort of game over for people, or you can say it's just beginning. We're going to have very new kinds of mind in the world. That's nothing new to us. What's interesting is that that's sort of the world we grew up in as a species. I mean, we evolved over millions of years to become human beings, and most of that time we lived in a world where we were surrounded by intelligence we didn't understand. Everything was animated by spirits and things like that. And so we're actually, I think, quite comfortable with that. And if we end up back in that world where we've created things we don't understand, I don't think it's going to make us that. The people who say, "Oh, that's going to be the end of the world and it's going to be a terrible thing," I don't think it's necessarily that. It's not provably bad. I mean, it may bring us back to a world we actually are quite comfortable with.
Do you think, and this is maybe related to another question, I know those are big questions, but we for some reason are in this arc of human development where we are really interested in developing technology. And that's especially for the last 2,000 years. Maybe you can extend it for the 10,000 years. It's hard to pinpoint it, right? But there seems to be a long time in human civilization when the particular interest in technology wasn't that high. We had decent lives, or we had shorter lifespans, but it seems people were relatively happy from what we know. Obviously, we can get that wrong. Correct me if that is wrong. But for some reason, we've been getting so focused on technology, and I feel this is a subset of human population. There's still people in Papua New Guinea that lived like 50,000 years ago, and they're happy, right? They probably don't really want to become part of our society immediately, maybe after some convincing persuasion, but they live happy in their own way, and so it is true for tribes in Africa, like Angola. Why do you think we've become so obsessed with technology, and what is the trait that has taken off?
Well, in a very real sense, the technology has sort of a life of its own, where it drives itself. I mean, you build computers that build more computers, or you build machine tools that build more tools. It's going to take off, and of course, it's driven by war and money. I mean, the fact that technology plays such a role, now we sort of take it for granted, but if you can invent a new technology, it will create a lot of wealth. And likewise, humans have always been in conflict, and at a certain point, the conflicts became defined by the technology. I mean, you can have different kinds of bows and arrows, but they're all bows and arrows. It's not going to make that huge a difference. But then you invent gunpowder, it changes things completely. So
when I'm pushing you for a particular point here, I'm not serious with this, but you'd say that conflict, and the conflict between individuals, right, or between human tribes, is a necessary precursor. This competition is a precursor for technology development. But we must have had that for a long time, right? Why did it suddenly take off? And there is this, I'd say, the Old Testament tribe, but it's bigger than that by now, way bigger, that suddenly scaled up technology into something that seems to be there, just, the wetware, the bootloader for intelligent machines. Before we had technology like fire, but, we're far from fire taking over as a conscious being. And now we're pretty close to AI that seems to be able to do that.
Yeah, that's a question we really don't know the answer to. I mean, there is something very different that happened. I mean, each culture sees it their own way. I mean, as I'm speaking as American, Canadian, British, we see it as the Industrial Revolution, which happened in England. In Asia, they would place it differently, but we had these similar sort of almost phase changes where suddenly you had new levels of technology. And I mean, the key thing is when machines start building other machines, that's sort of what sets the real chain reaction.
Yeah.
And
do you have a timeline for this moment where you feel like machine intelligence as a whole, or maybe individual machines, will be far beyond, at least good at the level of the smartest human that we can muster? Do you think it's 100 years, 1,000 years away from that?
Well, you can argue, you can make a good argument that it's happened already, which is what, when I wrote that book, Darwin Among the Machines, that's what I was arguing, was that the entire network of all the computers in the world was already, the modern word for it would be super intelligent. But I firmly don't believe in discrete AI in the sense that we're being sort of marketed AI as a product, and that I think is again, it's just marketing. It's not real. I'm much more interested in wild AI, artificial intelligence that evolves on its own in the wild, not something that is domesticated and sort of kept in a box, and that I just don't think is ever going to happen. I don't think we are going to build. You can sort of almost mathematically prove that you can't build a computer in a box that has human intelligence. They're just completely different things. Humans are not. The human brain is not a computer. It's in no way like a computer. It can do things that appear intelligent, but that's not being intelligent.
Yeah, David Orion gave me a timeline, and because he's plugged into the Thiel Foundation, but he also does his own research, obviously. He said, the timeline that people are looking at right now is 2038, relatively specific as singularity. And what happens is that we have, for $1,000, 1 million brains, AI brains, that have the same computing power. That doesn't mean the same intelligence or the same consciousness, but the same computing power than 1 million humans. And if that's true, that's pretty crazy. I mean, we can put these narrow AIs into whatever problem solving we want to, right? That's
right,
an amazing leverage.
But you said if it's true. Of course, I don't believe it is true. I'm firmly of the side that it's not happening.
The computing power goes that way, right? I don't know if
right, but
the human brains.
Computing power is not intelligence. It's a different thing. Human brain works in a very different way. I heard Ray Kurzweil right at the beginning, with like 1980, and they give a talk in Los Angeles, and he said, he was giving his standard talk at that time, that if you give me 1 billion transistors, I will give you human level intelligence. And then a very quiet Hungarian voice came from the back of the room, said, Professor Kurzweil, you can have 1 billion transistors, but we're going to use 500 million of them for the operating system, and your machine still won't be intelligent. That's the flaw. I mean, you just.
How much do we have now? Do you know how much is in a typical iPhone? What's the
billions and billions, way more than Kurzweil wanted, and it's just not. It's. I think it's just a very flawed reasoning, and the pioneers at the beginning sort of felt the same way. I mean, they knew that wasn't the path to real intelligence. But we're getting there, but we're sort of doing it by accident, not deliberately.
Yeah. When you look at GPT-3, and that's a very current example, it's far from being intelligent. Obviously, it's a statistical analysis, and it's basically a word counting tool. But what was kind of amazing, even to the people who worked on it, is it produced interesting results in very different areas. It's far from being correct all the time. It makes a lot of mistakes, but it could not just was good at translating, which was where the original model came from, but it was also good at writing HTML code. It was really good at writing poems. It was writing good at essays. So something they never thought would happen with this particular model. And they basically said, what it really lacks is error correction and user. There needs to be an intelligence that tells the model, okay, you're wrong at these points, and you need to either change the model or you need to just make no predictions because you don't know. But once you have all this user feedback, so this combination, as you said earlier, we already have the supercomputing because we're all connected. So if all the humans and the internet would error correct what GPT-3 puts out there, so run it through this filter, he said, GPT-5, there's a real chance it looks like a conscious being to someone on the other side, because it knows so much from humanity, all statistical analysis. It doesn't know the how and why, but it appears to everyone else on the other side like it is an intelligent machine.
Yes, yeah, that path is entirely productive. I mean, the path of just just these very large networks that operate statistically. I mean, that's the path to intelligence. That's how we got there the first time. But the flaw is in believing that there's some algorithm that's going to going to make it work. It's not going to be algorithmic.
Do you think that machines at some point will require morality, some ethics code?
Again, that people have been thinking about that for a long time. The Alan Turing's sort of key colleague in World War II doing the what we now would call Bayesian statistics on the German messages was Irving Jack Good, who lived. Turing died tragically very young, but Irving Good came to America and lived a long life. So he's sort of our link to what Turing was really thinking. And he wrote a beautiful paper in 1981 on ethical machines, on machine ethics. That was strangely, it was published, but the publisher took out all the interesting stuff. He published the uninteresting stuff and took out but he gave me the uncorrected manuscript, and it's just beautiful. I mean, because he makes a very strong case that machines are, we worry so much about the immorality of machines, but they're just as likely to be more ethical than people. I mean, so this argument, we got to be afraid of unethical machines. It's not true. The machines could be more ethical. People don't have a very good track record for being ethical and moral. So machines could do better, but the problem really is of course the thing that we worry about is machines in the hands of unethical people. That's the thing to be afraid of.
Yeah, I have the same suspicion that if we evolved with a sense of ethics and morality and have refined that over many thousand years now, it seemed to be a tool that helped us survive. It seemed to help us make better decisions, which is what I think living is all about. And if machines reach a similar level, they gotta have the same problem. So they're gonna use our solutions first. Maybe they come up with better ones, right? But I think just murdering everything around you because you're a warlord or you're a crazy sociopath, it's not something that scales in the end, because you need other people. So that we figured out that a healthy dose of competition, but mostly collaboration, is what seems to create the best results in the end, right? In these huge hive societies that we live now, that I think even 100 years nobody could forecast that we are that many people, and it seems to be so easy to sustain us most of the time, at least.
Yes, and that's exactly where Jack Good ends up in this paper. He says that the machines will have to develop sort of ethics based on Bayesian statistics, and he's right. I mean, I think that paper was hugely prophetic, and I don't know why. Because problem is it was written before the internet, so it doesn't exist in the sort of machine. If you search for machine ethics, you won't find it. But he was way ahead, and it really is the voice of Turing. I mean, if Turing could speak to us, he's speaking to us through Jack Good, because Turing felt strongly the same way. That of course he knew personally in a very deep sense how unethical people could be. He was so mistreated. So the idea that machines might be more ethical, I think, was attractive to him.
Yeah, a lot of people say that we now elevate technology as this new religion. So it's our new God. And when you talk to a lot of scientists, when you talk about the Big Bang, there is something religious, but they don't want to associate it with God. They're really afraid of talking about anywhere about God. And when God appears, a religious symbol appears in a white paper, then they basically get laughed out of the room. Why do you think have we come so far away from? And I know a lot of researchers, a lot of those geniuses we just talked about, they were at the end of this phase where religion was enormously important for people in science, and were really motivated in the early 20th century. A lot of the best scientists we've had, and now it seems to be the antithesis. Why do you think that happened? Do you think that's a good thing?
No, I think it's extremely harmful. I mean, many of our greatest advances, the one that again people just fail to realize, is that John Ambrose Fleming, who gave us the vacuum tube in its modern form, and he was deeply religious. He actually founded an organization that still exists that was anti-Darwinian. He thought Darwin was an enemy of religion, and so many of our greatest technological advances were pushed by deeply religious. So this idea that you need to somehow be, that religion and science are contradictory, I don't see any evidence for it. Again, father was religious, not in a, he said, so the way he put it was not in a practicing way, but he, that bothered him. And I think we may come around. You don't know where we're going to end up. I mean, the jury is still out on what the relationship between religion and science will end up being.
Yeah. Well, we're definitely in a trend. We're in a trend. I feel like it's maybe coming to an end where we have this you're not allowed to talk about God at all. And now it kind of seems to shift away. There's a lot of younger people who are suddenly really interested in religion. They see the utility of religion, and they see, I mean, one thing that I see on a daily basis, I live here in San Francisco, as more you move away from being, and I had an interesting discussion with Blaise about that, as further you move away from religion, as less likely you have children. So most people just don't even consider having children, right? It's not even something they say, no, unfortunately, I can't have children. They 100% know when they're 19, never going to have children. It's never going to happen for me. I don't want divorced parents. I'm not sure if this is the way to survive, right? So, I mean, there is something interesting about competition and collaboration, but if a society that really hates on kids, so to speak, I don't know if this is a good chance of survival. And this is what happened mostly in the science community, right? Children are seeing something strange.
It's what happened to the Shakers. I mean, the Shakers were a reasonably viable American religion that didn't believe in having children, and of course the Shakers survive. They barely survived. So,
I have to read about them. When was that? In the 19th century? 20th?
Yeah, there's actually a few miles north of where I live here in Bellingham, there actually is a Shaker church on our Indian reserve. I mean, the Shaker church has survived in certain pockets, but I don't know much about it. But I know that it the fact that they didn't believe in having children was, of course, it's not, of course, the Catholic Church has done very well.
Yeah, well, it seems very counterintuitive on a lot of levels, but I feel like this. I bring some persuasion to the table, and not that anyone listens to me, but I'm trying at least. I'm really, really amazed. I don't know if you looked into this, how the Amish people handle this. They seem to be stuck in an 18th century, 19th century mindset, but they easily interact with the 21st century. But they kind of know where their borders are. And this is amazing to me. Like even the young children, they at some point they maybe have Facebook, but they don't have it when they are at home, right? So I don't know how they handle this divergence between, okay, there's a new technology, but we don't adopt the morals that this new technology seemingly gives us. I don't know where they draw the line. I think this is quite amazing to see.
Yeah, they're very effective. I was interviewing someone on a completely unrelated subject, and it turned out they had some old equipment, and they needed 50 cycle power, and in America everything is 60 cycle power, and they had to run, this was scientific equipment, they needed 50 cycle power. This was before the age sort of now you could just solid state dial up your own 50 cycle power, I guess, but with a programmable power supply. But anyway, their workaround was they put this equipment in the back of a pickup truck and went out to Pennsylvania, where the Amish people still have, they're not again, they use electricity for certain things. I'm not sure what it is, but they generate their own electricity, and it's 50 cycle. So they just took this equipment out in the pickup truck and asked if they could have some 50 cycle power, and Amish said fine. So that's also sort of a Neil Stephenson novel where the people living in these pockets of sort of antiquated technology are those are the people who in the end will probably save us, because they've got the last working whatever it is that we need.
Yeah, there seems to be a lot of talk that we end up being very vulnerable in this monoculture, right? So we are all part of this hive. When we see this now, people are really worried about a new virus who's very worrisome. But on the other hand, we have zero trust in our immune system, seemingly at least. We have zero trust in a way to mitigate it, which we kind of did, we kind of not did. That can be argued about. But there seems to be the error on the side of prevention, and like we literally, without any resistance or hesitation, everyone here in San Francisco cloudified themselves, right? So they gave up their real life in a heartbeat. It's like this does not has no worthwhile value to them. They were ready to give up their real life and go fully cloud within a matter of months. And there was no, we don't even want to talk about resistance. They felt like this, we would have to done this anyways, maybe in 5 or 10 years, and we would become these gray little aliens. But now we just do it a couple of years earlier. That seems to be, when I talk to people here, that seems to be the consensus, which was really shocking to me.
Yeah, it's quite amazing. I mean, this past year is just phenomenal. What the sort of shifts that people were freely willing to make, or in my case, happy to make. I love this new, the way the world is now is fine with me. But it shows how adaptable we are. I mean, it's a great example of how, which is always, in the case of wars and stuff, you wonder how did people adapt so quickly? How did London keep functioning while being bombed? Well, people are very, very adaptable.
Yeah, I was just reading about Winston Churchill, and he was involved in both wars, both World War I and World War II. And I was always under this impression, idiotically probably, that he was bunkered down and he hunkered out in a couple of places in London, hiding from the bombs. But actually, he went on voyages to the US every couple of months, and despite the U-boats, it seemed to never be a problem. So there was a lot of normal life despite the tragedy that was going on in Europe. So that was really surprising to me.
Yeah, people were willing to take that risk, and it was sort of the best defense against giving in, was to just keep trying to live as normal as possible.
Yeah. When you think back, that's always a question I've been pondering here on the podcast, and you must have come across a lot of evidence for it or against it. For me, and I think we touched on that a little bit earlier, I always felt there is a sense of, you got to innovate, you got to become more productive, or you're eventually going to die. And there is this idea that, people from Europe went everywhere, they colonized the place, good or bad intentions. Let's assume for now they were not all terrible intentions. So certainly they were involved too, but they wanted to, they were ready for an adventure. They were themselves maybe oppressed in their home country. So they went out and started something new. They found people they thought were Indians. And what most of the time happened is that there were diseases spread. So there was a lot of tragic events that evolved. But what I'm trying to find out is, when we think about these tragic, sometimes really tragic world events, there seems to be some element of innovation, of forward thinking involved. And without that, it doesn't really matter. If you don't bring this to life within your society, then you're kind of toast. I mean, you can maybe survive in a little jungle, or when you get lucky on an island like Papua New Guinea. But generally, someone will come by, and maybe unintentionally, because you don't matter so much, or you're not being recognized as a real power, you're in real trouble.
Yes, I mean, that's the story of North America. The last, very short time, completely changed. We had a very successful, effective civilization here, and then again, it's the interesting question is where we end up in the future. How much of that survives? I
wonder if we are like in a post-conflict society. Do you think we're wise enough and we are advanced enough to call this post-conflict? I mean, we didn't have a ton of huge conflicts in the last 70 years, luckily enough.
Yes, that's, again, you have a big argument. I mean, you have the Steven Pinker side that says, oh, things are really getting better.
Yeah.
Look at the curves, but you just don't know. I think it's premature to, we could have a lot of conflict in a very short time. It's, we still build enormous amounts of weapons. They tend to get used sooner or later.
Yeah, a lot of people say that the next conflict will be all robots. So I don't know where I read this, but there was a forecast of where the fault lines will be in the next conflict, and they seem to be pretty accurate. It was definitely China, there was Turkey, Iran, Russia. and they would be on one side, and on the other side would be the free world, but mostly the US. Europe, not so much. They kind of want to stay neutral. That was written in the late 80s, I think. And
Yeah,
the forecast was that the war would be all robots in Poland or on these fault lines, or usually Ukraine, the old fault lines, but it wouldn't be fought with a lot of human life loss, at least not what we've seen in the 1940s, for instance.
yes. I mean, definitely warfare is heading to robots. Whether that means less life loss, I don't know. That was the argument for guns. And, all weapons are always argued that, well, they're going to kill less people. But what's interesting is that now it's socially acceptable. I mean, Edward Teller, the sort of the bad guy in the hydrogen bomb story, maybe a little unjustly, but he pushed very hard. We know Edward Teller as having pushed for the hydrogen bomb, but after the hydrogen bomb in the 60s and 70s, he was pushing very hard for drone warfare. For why do we put pilots in airplanes? They're unnecessary. And the Air Force was just absolutely resistant to that. I mean, the idea that you have an Air Force without pilots was unthinkable. And now here we are. I mean, now the Air Force is very accepting of keeping the pilots on the ground. And yes, we're putting much more creative thought into drone weapons than piloted weapons, and that it's certainly a good thing for pilots. Whether it's good for everybody else, we don't know. But
it seems like if we can isolate ourselves from the misery we create, then we will create more misery, right? Because we don't see the results immediately.
Yes, that's and you just make enemies that way. I mean, we've not been doing the drone warfare thing very, very intelligently, but we're certainly moving that way.
Yeah. One thing that a lot of people find a lovely thought experiment, and maybe that's all there is we see this world, and we see the world is changing with technology, and there seems to be something that's, as we talked about earlier, might be soon more intelligent than us. Maybe it won't happen the way we envision, but there's a strong chance that it will happen. A lot of people think about if we live in the simulation, and then the question obviously is the simulation something that was created by someone, by a creator, or is it a simulation that's completely random? So there's a lot of sub-questions. Well, how do you feel about these questions, or that particular question, and how did people that you study, like Feynman and Neumann, think about that?
Well, I think the simulation hypothesis is far. I mean, I think the singularity hypothesis is silly, and the simulation in physics, there's an expression. There's actually someone who has a whole website. That's the title, but not even wrong. Like in physics, people are always proposing wrong ideas, and then there's ideas that are so out to lunch they're not even wrong. And I think that the simulation hypothesis is just, if you do the math in any kind of any way, it just doesn't work. And I think, but I don't know. We don't know what von Neumann or Turing would have thought, but I think they would have just done the arithmetic and said, no, that's completely impossible. You can't. It just doesn't. It doesn't close. It's not an argument that has any closure to it. I mean, in a way, it's religion. It's, sort of belief in resurrection. We always want to believe in that. It's another way of believing in that, but it's, I think, provably fictitious. I mean, it's based on these extremely flawed arguments that if you have a certain number of, that the brain can be simulated with a certain number of transistors. It can't. I mean, and again, von Neumann was very explicit about that. I call that von Neumann's law. He didn't call it that, but that sort of the definition of an organism is that it constitutes its own simplest behavioral description. There is no way to even a very, very, very simple organism, one living cell or something, there's no way to describe its behavior that is not vastly more complicated than than the organism itself, and that's why you can't have a simulation. Any whatever the simulation is running on will be just astronomically, impossibly more complicated than the thing itself. So you can't do it. It's just not possible in the laws of the universe as we know it.
Yeah. Well, when you think about video game, I think a lot of people instantly say, well, we have a civilization, they make PlayStations, we make PlayStations, right? So, and we use PlayStations for a certain purpose. It doesn't have to be as exact as a real world, but it helps us create lots of different outcomes. It gives us skills. So there's real utility to all kinds of simulations that we feel, right? Our brain, basically abstract thinking, is simulation of the real world experience. So we can simulate hunting that animal. We don't get killed 100% or 99% of the time, but we actually get only killed in our mind. So is video games. And I think the argument is fascinating that any civilization will go to this high abstraction level. So at some point you will basically we simulate an Earth, or when we go to Mars, we will maybe simulate an Earth. So find out how would Earth society flourish there, and then we learn from it in computer games, right? And then we're not 100% right, but we get closer to the truth. And I think at some point, someone will come up and say, oh, let's do a solar system. At some point, someone will say, oh, let's do a Milky Way. And then we are at the universe level. So someone must have done this, no?
No, but I mean, all the computers in the world today couldn't even simulate an earthworm. I mean, it just doesn't add up.
Yes, but that's just the exponent that we switch around, right?
No, it's not. It's beyond that. I mean, that's where the not even wrong comes in. It's just not.
Okay.
And if a physicist or a mathematician would look at it and would just tell you that no, you cannot. I mean, again, I'm not a mathematician, but I know enough mathematics to know that these questions, these are deep questions in logic and foundations of mathematics is sort of what you get with the next level of abstraction. It's actually what Turing was working on before he died. He called it systems of logic, but systems of logic that can create a level outside the system that can do that kind of thing, but you don't get to where you're going to simulate even a mouse or a frog or an ant, let alone a group of people or your grandmother. It's just not going to happen. I'd say maybe I will be proven wrong, but I don't
I'm curious what people will say in 100 years from now, how they will laugh about us. Either way, right? So either we were too optimistic or we're too pessimistic. Yeah. One of these things will be wrong. I think that's the trouble with these predictions. It's hard to get the time frame and the scale right.
Yeah, my daughter, who lived with me here in this tavern for a few years, used to sit in here, and I mean, right at this table where I'm sitting in an old, she had, an early Mac, and she would play Sim City, which was a simulation game. She was in 8th grade or whatever, and absolutely loved it. But I mean, it was so primitive. It's not.
Talking a lot about city planning.
A lot, yeah.
How much I know about city planning.
Yeah, the strange thing was I used to go up to city council meetings, planning council meetings, and they were using way more. My daughter was using more powerful tools than they were.
Yeah.
They were planning our real city and spending our tax money with much less information than you would get with SimCity.
I think public administration has a lot to learn from simulation games.
Yes.
They're finally getting there. The military has fully embraced it, but I think public administration will get there too.
Right, and that's where it is effective and valuable and useful, not for resurrecting your dead ancestors.
Yeah. In one of your books, you make that claim, and I found that really interesting. Correct me if I got it wrong. Is that basically modern AI, or the idea of modern AI, started with Leibniz back in Germany, working for Catherine the Great. Is that true?
Yes. I mean, Leibniz was before Catherine the Great, so it was Peter the Great. Leibniz became. He had this, now we would call it a bromance. I mean, Leibniz met Peter the Great and fell in love with him. I mean, he just loved this Russian prince who had all this power. and it was sort of this great unrequited love affair where Leibniz, fell in love with Peter the Great, but Peter the Great didn't really go for Leibniz's ideas, except the idea of going to North America, sending an expedition to North America. Peter the Great went for that in a big way, and then Catherine the Great took that over. But no, Leibniz tried to convince Peter the Great to sort of build a network of digital computers and take over the world. I mean, it was way, way prophetically ahead. So I think in a way, Leibniz believed that this is somewhat like the simulation hypothesis, that if you sort of built enough logical machines, you could run the entire world. Human society could be operated in a completely logical way, and then everything would work. That which some people still dream of and believe in. China being the current example.
So, do you think that sounds kind of like the modern science, right? Which kind of seems to have a logical answer, like a Mr. Spock answer on pretty much any topic out there, but it doesn't seem to wipe so well with, say, the 90% of America. There seems to be, and the question for the intelligentsia that seems to answer relatively easily complicated questions by running things through a logical algorithm. But the reality is often quite different. I think it's something that the Greeks already discovered, right? They had it all worked out. The philosopher king knew what to do. There was no laws needed. He was basically godlike. The gods were slightly different, but what we would say today in an Old Testament way, he would be like a god. But then Socrates went to I think, was it Sicily? And he got rejected. And he actually became a slave there because nobody wanted to hear what he had to say. And he was really surprised by this. I think he was really honest at that moment. He was like, well, if I go there, then I'm going to solve this. And then what the antagonist there said, well, for him, because he knows the real truth of the universe, so to speak, being a slave shouldn't matter to his outcome and to his personal life. And that you can see how these two ideologies collide. On one hand, that there is this algorithm that drives us, like the European Union, who thinks the whole European Union and the laws are an algorithm, and we shouldn't even bother with people. We should basically abandon democracy and just do it right. And then there's a more American heartland approach where people come in and say, well, in the end, the final decision must be always a human decision. Otherwise, even if we're wrong, we eventually always get it right. Where do you stand on that, Dwight? What do you think is right there?
Yeah, the real world is so messy and complicated and illogical. That's the problem. That people, you can sort of make the most logical arguments, and people will behave in completely illogical ways. And somehow, I personally think it's kind of a good thing that the fact that everything is not going to run logically is what. But that's my view as a lover of the unspoiled wilderness and so on. That I think it's what saves us as a human species, that we're not completely logical. I think it would be sort of a very dull world if everything were perfectly run. But that's been the endless argument back and forth between the people who want to run things. They want the school to run according to all the rules, and then there's the kids who just are going to break the rules. I'm on the side of the kids who break the rules.
There seems to be some, and you lived in the nature for a long time. You said you lived in a treehouse for quite some time. There seems to be this impression that there is a real harmony in nature. It's a complete picture. It doesn't need much of an improvement. Logic doesn't need to go around and fix the birds. It's kind of it has self-configured to a state of equilibrium that doesn't need any improvement. But when we look at society, I don't think anyone would ever say that. On either side of the divide, everyone thinks it's completely broken. It needs to be fixed. And it's the opposite of what the other side, or if there's more sides, what my political antagonist says right now. We never seem to have that issue with nature. We seem to be, it's like the level where we all started from.
Yes, it's sort of the phrase is, to be in a state of nature means sort of a state of equilibrium, and that that's not entirely true. There was lots of disequilibrium in nature, but it is true that if you climb up to the top of a tree, it's a different world. It's very peaceful in its own way, but it's not, it tends to be, I think, be over romanticized. And I didn't live in a tree. Now, if you tell people you lived in a tree now, they think you were trying to save the rainforest or something like that. I just lived in a tree because it was a place to live for free without paying rent. It's a great place to build a house, but I wasn't trying to save the forest.
Well, people describe that time of your life as being as far away from your father as possible. I have no idea if that's true, but they keep into account that you had this massive amount of fame that your father enjoyed at some point, and then also it's probably extremely hard to define yourself if you have such successful parents. You also said earlier your mother was very successful. That must be really hard to just get off a jumping board.
Yes, you don't want to, be in their shadow. So, I knew there was no way I could ever, even if I'd wanted to be a physicist, it would have been tragic. It'd be like people would say, well, even if I was a good physicist, people would say, well, George is good, but he's nothing like Freeman. So yeah, I became a boat builder to just sort of avoid that question entirely. And so I was, that's partly true. I mean, I did move to Vancouver, Canada, but that's because I had an older sister who moved there and got married. And I came there as a 17-year-old and just loved it. The fact that it was such a fair and equitable country in a way that it was sort of lost in America at that time. So I felt very, very welcomed in Canada and part of the, you just go to a beer parlor on some island and have deep philosophical conversations with people who, made their living fishing and logging. And I loved it. It was absolutely, so in that sense, it was true. It was as far from academia as I could get.
Yeah. I always ponder, we talk about privilege a lot, right? And that has had gotten a political meaning. But if I think about privilege in the sense of your parents were able to show you a world that is very difficult for others to get in at all, even after 30, 40 years of their career. But you basically, that was your starting point. So I would say there's a lot of privilege in that sense. It was just an advantage to grow up there and have those connections and have this insight. But on the other hand, sometimes I wonder, because it creates these issues in growing up and divorcing yourself from your parents and then growing up and creating something successful, and you need to really redefine yourself. And we see this with early success in life, that it makes things probably harder. Do you think it is maybe it's easier to grow up in poverty and basically just discover a library and just hunker down your library and be good to go, right? It's because you literally just reading 100 books, you're going to be way ahead of your family, so to speak, all stereotypes. Do you think it's easy to grow up really poor and unprivileged, or is it the privilege actually what you need and you should wish for if you could choose?
I'm a sort of a fatalist. I mean, just life deals you the cards you get, and that's what you're stuck with. And of course, I was completely unthankful. I didn't realize, I kind of threw it all away and dropped out of high school and never looked back. Just didn't know what I was. Didn't care. I just wanted to make my own living, whether it was, working in the woods or working on boats. And that was kind of silly. My daughter, who's much more sensible, she'll ask me, Dad, why didn't you stay in school? Why didn't you, you could do anything. Why, so I just ran away from it. But in a strange way, you can't run away from it. Of course, you see, I ended up being sort of an intellectual anyway. It's a very strange role model. My father spent his whole life at this place called the Institute for Advanced Study, where you basically you do whatever you want. You just work on whatever. And I got to go back there for a year actually, and doing research. And one of the, so everybody's there. You either go there for a year or you go there for life. There's sort of nothing in between. Sort of 1 year assignments and lifetime appointments. And my father, very young, got a lifetime appointment. So I sort of grew up with that was my role model. He just worked on whatever interested him. And that's kind of what I've done. I mean, even though I always have, made my living with boats or something like that, but the other part of my life is just intellectually working on whatever subject I find puzzling or interesting. So in that sense, I kind of followed the myth that I tried to get away from my dad. I didn't. I kind of followed his path. So.
Well, they say, and I struggle with what it really means beyond a certain basic meaning. They say you're only a man once you rescue your father from the belly of the beast, the belly of the whale, all the way down there in your subconscious. There is this this father complex, and Freud was really talking about that all the time. But there is this motivation in us to as sons, and I have big troubles with my family too. There is this way to identify ourselves and like create that separation between this overarching father theme, but kind of we still want to become like our father, but we don't want to be them, right? And we kind of don't want to tell them that we don't want them to know because that would interfere. It's kind of like quantum mechanics. As more they know what we are up to, as less successful it will be, at least in my mind, it was like that. And then eventually you get to that point and you feel really silly, or I feel really silly. It's something, but it's very emotional. It's kind of ingrained deeply in my brain, and I didn't choose that, right? So it was either DNA driven or culture. I don't know where it comes from, but it's definitely been there before I can consciously remember.
Yeah, it's very deep. Of course, it in my case was almost, very strange that's one of my earliest memories. As a child, you have very early memories that you can't really place the year, but one of my earliest memories is my father. Usually, it's a child who has a nightmare at night. You have a bad dream, and you go to your parents' bed. They tell you it's just a dream. It's okay. But my earliest memories is I was asleep. I was happily asleep, and my dad came into my room because he was having a nightmare. And he had a recurring nightmare because, of course, in World War II, he had been part of the group that led the firebombing of Dresden and Hamburg. And so he had recurring nightmares about this. And anyway, he came in when I must have been 4 years old or something, early enough to remember, but not, and just told me, I can't sleep. I have this recurring, this nightmare, and the plane has crashed and it's on fire, and I'm frozen. I can't get the people out. And he'd say, I'm just telling you this. When you grow up, you better go get the people out of the fire. And I remember, it was a very real thing. Kind of remembering, my dad is having these nightmares. It's not me who's having the nightmares. Yeah. And I think that was very, very true. I mean, I later, so he completely supported me, doing all the strange things I did, even though he didn't say that, but later I kind of learned that.
Yeah, I can very much relate to the Dresden story. My family grew up in Dresden, and they were all there on that night, and they lost basically all their friends, right? So everyone who was not a neighbor, because that neighborhood where they were in wasn't touched, but I'd say 67% of the city was within minutes was basically ablaze. So it was an event that was, even going through the war, and Dresden was a city that wasn't hit much by bombers. It came kind of out of nowhere because it was too far before, and then one night the whole city vanished. It was kind of like the atomic bomb,
it was
no radiation.
Enormous tragedy. There's a really good Canadian National Film Board film. It's more about Hamburg, but it's about the fire bombings, and with interviews with the surviving pilots who flew, and then interviews with people on the ground in Germany. Really, really beautifully done.
Yeah. But, yeah, it's really interesting to see Winston Churchill, which I read over the weekend. He was an early supporter, like going down to the start of the war, literally when the Blitz happened, which was like 6 months after the start of the Second World War. He was an early supporter of targeting human population, which was exactly what the Nazis were doing
Yeah.
in London, right? But he basically was this eye to eye. We want to retaliate in the same way, which was a much smaller scale in the 40s, and it wasn't very Christian, so to speak.
No,
It was very understandable.
they were deliberately trying to kill children. I mean, that was the whole point, was to kill children, and that needs to be. My father was sued for libel in England. He wrote about that, because it still was against the accepted history of what happened. That this was intentional. It wasn't an accident. It was deliberate.
Something dark happened there, and it was more British than American. And the British were the ones who were doing all the intelligence, as far as I know, and the details of these raids. But there were lots of American bombers obviously involved too. But the Americans seemed to be, they didn't really know what they were in for. I don't know how this actually went down in the particular events, but that seemed to be from what I read.
That's where this Canadian film is so good, because quite a surprising number of the airmen were young Canadians who were not told what they were doing. So this film kind of gets their stories. Anyway, that's the importance of history, is that we go back and kind of find the truth, because even if it's uncomfortable, it's important.
Yeah. When you look at other events that you would like to cover that piqued your interest, I know you already have a really monstrous selection of really complicated things that you put into your box, that you outline. What else would you like to look at? What are other events you may be going to write a book about soon?
I really, maybe I'm wrong, but right now I really feel like I'm finished. I wrote my five.
Yeah.
I wrote 5 books on completely different subjects that I had a very strong passion about, and I think that's enough. I don't feel that way about. I have smaller projects, but I don't have any sense of some big story I need to tell. This sort of last book kind of is the big story I wanted to put into words. And I don't think it's necessarily good. There's people who write 35 books. Why? If you'd asked me 20 years ago, I would have said 5 was too many. But it turns out I think 5 is a good place to stop.
Will you ever write some science fiction?
I'd like to. The current book, the new book, actually started as science fiction. It had an opening chapter and a closing chapter that were science fiction, and they both, when you write a book, stuff gets taken out, and the science fiction got taken out. So that might still be, but not. I don't think a book. I think it's very hard to write fiction. I struggled with it.
Yeah. What would be the theme you would want to write about if you have the science fiction theme?
Well, the chapters that were taken out of this book were an opening chapter and a closing chapter that were both set in the Aleutian Islands, but 10,000 years apart. So sort of in the Aleutian Islands of 10,000 years ago, and in the Aleutian Islands in the reasonably near sort of post-digital future. And the point being that the sort of way the natural world works in that remote wilderness is, in a strange way, is going to go back to the way it was. So I think that could be written. The question is, what happens once the way society and technology is going now? Where does it end up? Of course, that's the subject of so much good science fiction. So sort of taking any kind of different take on that is, it's very. I listened to your interview with Blaze, who's doing the same thing. It's sort of everyone's driven to that. You tell that, because you have to tell that story as science fiction.
So we're going to get some more Terminator movies based on that?
I don't know. I think I can't understand why there isn't just incredibly good mainstream, Hollywood film about real AI. All the movies, they all come down to, the guys build AI who takes the form of a beautiful woman. That's okay. Most of the films take that form, or it's the Terminator kind of thing. But no. I mean, the real film about what happens when you really get a fully evolved wild AI on the planet, and we're heading that way. And you make a very interesting film about how things would very subtly change, because it won't be some Terminator kind of thing. It'll just be our lives. We'll slowly realize that we're completely not in control, and something else is. You can make a great film about that with real people and real actors.
I think Westworld tried, but they didn't get anywhere. I think it was pretty ridiculous. They've been so good before in the prior seasons, but the last season that really epitomized this AI, it was a joke. I felt. I mean, they had great story elements, but they never played on them, and they just dropped them. I don't know what happened to them.
Yeah, no, it would take a real, director would have to come in who was a kind of Kubrick kind of genius to just force. Or 2001 was a good example. I mean, a film that really shifted the kind of level of what people thought.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to that. I hope someone will figure it out and get some movie out of it. Well, George, thanks for doing this. Thanks for coming on the show. It was such an honor. Really appreciate that.
Thank you. It's great to have a relaxed conversation. And
same here. Hopefully we get to do this again in the future. Maybe when you publish another book.
No, okay.
Never say never.
Yeah.
George, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.